This CEO hated children until a little girl cried in court, revealing her mother still waited for him. What would you do if you discovered someone never stopped loving you? The marble floors of Chicago's federal courthouse echoed with expensive shoes as reporters filled every seat. At the witness stand sat James Mitchell, 45 years old and worth $3 billion, his steel gray eyes cold as winter. The CEO of Mitchell Tech Corporation had built an empire through calculated decisions, leaving him isolated from human warmth. James answered each question with mechanical precision. The media called this corporate lawsuit the trial of the century, but to James, it was another obstacle to conquer. His reputation for ruthless business tactics matched his well-known aversion to children. Mr. Mitchell, the attorney continued, explained the circumstances surrounding the alleged patent theft. James leaned forward in his tailored charcoal suit. Mitchell Tech maintains the highest standards. Any allegations are baseless. Bang! The courtroom doors exploded open. A small figure burst through, a little girl with brilliant copper hair streaming behind her. Her red shoes thundered against marble as she ran down the aisle, ignoring security guards' shouts. "Daddy! Daddy!" she screamed, tears streaming down her cheeks. The courtroom erupted. Cameras flashed, reporters jumped up, the judge banged his gavel. 8-year-old Sophie Carter wore a cherry-red dress with yellow flowers, copper curls held with yellow ribbons. James sat frozen, face draining of color as this tiny tornado charged toward him. Children were his weakness, his fear. "Please," Sophie sobbed, grabbing his sleeve with trembling hands. "You have to save Mommy. She's dying and I don't know what to do." James stared at this impossible child, with sapphire blue eyes too wise for her age. "I'm not your father," James stammered, his commanding presence shattered. "You're confusing me with someone else." Sophie reached into her pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph. James's heart stopped. There he was, 9 years younger, arm in arm with a stunning woman with green eyes and blonde hair. Both laughing, radiating happiness, standing before a hospital. Rachel Carter in scrubs, her last day of nursing school. "Mommy kept this by her bed every night," Sophie whispered. "She said you'd come back when we needed you most." She never stopped believing. The photograph trembled in James's hands as memories crashed over him. Rachel's laugh, her dreams of helping sick children, the engagement ring he'd bought but never gave her. Everything after this photo remained blank, lost in confusion and pain. "I saw you on TV," Sophie continued through tears. "Mommy watches when you're on the news. She says you're just lost, but good people find their way home." "Order!" the judge shouted as security gently escorted Sophie away. "She's at Municipal Hospital," Sophie cried desperately. "Room 314. Please, Daddy. Mommy's been asking for you." As the doors closed, James sat stunned, clutching the photograph. The trial was adjourned, but he barely heard. All he could think about were those sapphire eyes that looked disturbingly familiar, and a dying woman who apparently never stopped loving him. What terrified him most was realizing that deep in his frozen heart, he was already starting to love them back. Back in his office on the 50th floor, James couldn't concentrate. The photograph Sophie had shown him haunted every thought. He remembered clearly the day it was taken, but everything afterward remained frustratingly blank. Rachel Carter. How could he have forgotten those gentle green eyes and that smile that lit up any room? They met at university 9 years ago. Rachel was finishing nursing school, James completing his MBA. She was everything he wasn't. Warm, optimistic, dreaming of helping people. They fell in love intensely, planning to marry after graduation. But then something happened. James pressed his temples, trying to remember. There were fights, accusations, Rachel crying. His mother Margaret always present, whispering things in his ear. He remembered taking anxiety medication during that time. Everything became foggy. "Why did you betray me, Rachel?" He remembered screaming. But betray him how? When? The details remained elusive. His assistant entered nervously. "Mr. Mitchell, the media is speculating about a secret daughter. Dozens of reporters are in the lobby." "Hire investigators," James ordered coldly. "I want to know everything about Rachel Carter and this child. And I want lawyers preparing a DNA test." But even as he spoke, an inner voice whispered that Sophie had his eyes. Exactly his eyes. James stared out at the Chicago skyline, but all he could see was that little girl's desperate face. The way she'd said, "Daddy," with such absolute certainty, as if she'd been practicing the word her entire life. The photograph she carried proved they had a history, but the gaping hole in his memory made him feel like a stranger to his own life. Remembered fragments. Rachel studying late into the night, her hair falling across textbooks, the way she'd make him coffee during finals week. She'd wanted to work in pediatrics, said children deserved advocates who truly cared. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd become a man who actively avoided children. Margaret's voice echoed in his memory. "That woman will ruin your future, James. She's not our kind of people." But what had his mother done? What had really happened? 9 years ago? The anxiety medication he'd taken back then, prescribed by whom? For what exactly? The memories felt deliberately buried, like someone had taken an eraser to the most important chapters of his life. His phone buzzed with urgent messages from board members, stock analysts, media relations. The courtroom scene was already viral. #secret daughter trending on social media. His carefully constructed public image was crumbling in real time, but all James could think about was a dying woman in a hospital bed who had apparently never stopped waiting for him, and a little girl who believed with absolute faith that her daddy would come save them. For the first time in decades, James Mitchell wondered if he'd been living someone else's life. Against every instinct for self-preservation, James drove to Municipal Hospital. The building was gray and deteriorated, with overcrowded corridors and the distinct smell of cheap disinfectant. So different from the private hospitals he knew. In the ICU, he found Rachel Carter connected to multiple machines, pale as paper, breathing with difficulty. At 35, she looked fragile and broken, but still maintained the serene beauty that had captivated him years ago. Sophie sat beside the bed, reading Alice in Wonderland aloud to her unconscious mother. Her childlike voice echoed in the silent room, and James noticed how she gently touched Rachel's hand with each paragraph, as if trying to keep her connected to the world. "Mommy likes this story," Sophie explained when she noticed James in the doorway. "She always said I was like Alice, too curious for my own good." The nurse explained that Rachel suffered from a mysterious neurological condition that attacked her nervous system 2 weeks ago. "We've never seen anything like it. She collapsed at work and hasn't woken up since." Sophie ran to James, pulling him by the hand. "I knew you'd come. Mommy always said you were good deep down, that you were just lost." She showed him a small photo album hidden in her backpack, all pictures of James and Rachel together, carefully preserved. "Mommy kept everything," Sophie whispered. "She never gave up on you." James knelt beside the bed, studying Rachel's peaceful face. Even unconscious, she looked like she was waiting for something. The monitors beeped steadily, but her condition seemed grave. "The doctors say her brain activity is minimal," Sophie said matter-of-factly, with the wisdom of a child forced to grow up too quickly. "But I know she can hear us. When I read to her, sometimes her fingers move." James watched this little girl who should be playing with dolls instead of keeping vigil over her dying mother. The injustice of it all hit him like a physical blow. "How long have you been taking care of her alone?" he asked gently. Since she got sick. Before that, we took care of each other. Sophie's simple words carried the weight of 8 years of awe. Devotion. As James looked at Rachel's still form and Sophie's hopeful face, he realized that whether or not he was ready, he was already part of this story. The question wasn't whether Sophie was his daughter. Deep down, he already knew. The question was whether he had the courage to become the father she believed him to be. James hired Chicago's best private investigators, determined to uncover the truth. He also requested an urgent DNA test, though something deep inside him already knew the answer. The report arrived 3 days later, devastating in its completeness. Rachel had worked tirelessly as a nurse in public hospitals for 8 years, raising Sophie alone. Records showed she never married, never dated seriously. Neighbors described her as a devoted mother who spoke of the child's father with love, not bitterness. More shocking, Rachel had tried to contact James multiple times in the early years. Letters sent to his company, emails to old addresses, even a personal visit to his office, all blocked or intercepted by assistants who said James didn't want contact. James remembered none of these attempts. The investigator also revealed that Rachel had lost her job 3 months ago when her health began to gradually deteriorate. First came headaches and fatigue, then mental confusion, until the final collapse. Medical bills drained all her savings, the investigator reported. They lost their apartment and were living in a rented room when she fainted. Through it all, Sophie never lost faith. Teachers reported she always said, "My daddy will come back when mommy needs him." James felt the crushing weight of guilt. A daughter had grown up waiting for him, and he didn't even know she existed. The file contained school records, showing Sophie was an exceptional student despite their circumstances. Her teachers noted her maturity and kindness, how she helped classmates and never complained about her situation. One teacher wrote, "Sophie draws the same picture every day, a family of 3 holding hands." When asked about it, she says she's practicing for when her family is together again. Medical records painted a grim picture of Rachel's condition. The mysterious illness had attacked her nervous system systematically, leaving doctors baffled. But what struck James most was a note in her personal effects. A letter she'd written to Sophie, apparently in case she didn't survive. "My darling girl," it read, "if something happens to me, remember that your daddy is a good man who lost his way. He didn't abandon us by choice. Someone made him believe lies about us. But love always finds a way home. Keep believing, sweet Sophie. Daddy will come when you need him most." The investigator's final revelation was perhaps the most troubling. "Mr. Mitchell, someone has been watching them for years. We found evidence of surveillance, photos taken from a distance, reports on their daily activities. Someone wanted to know exactly where they were and what they were doing." James stared at the surveillance photos of Sophie walking to school, Rachel working late shifts, both of them living simple, honest lives, while someone in the shadows documented their every move. Who had been watching his family? And why? The answers to those questions would change everything he thought he knew about his own life. While waiting for the DNA results, James found himself visiting the hospital daily. Initially, he told himself it was mere curiosity, but the truth ran deeper. Sophie fascinated and terrified him in equal measure. The girl was extraordinarily mature for her 8 years, yet maintained a pure innocence that James thought no longer existed in the world. She asked direct questions. "Why did you abandon Mommy?" Without malice, only genuine curiosity that pierced straight through his carefully constructed defenses. Sophie showed him her drawings. Always the same family of 3. A woman with long hair, a man in a suit, and a red-haired little girl, all holding hands. "I've been drawing this since I learned to hold crayons," she explained, her small fingers tracing the figures lovingly. Mommy said if I believed hard enough, you'd come back. One evening, when Sophie fell asleep in the uncomfortable hospital chair beside her mother, James covered her with his $3,000 Armani coat. For the first time in his life, he felt a genuine protective instinct, fierce and irrational. Watching her sleep, so small and vulnerable, he understood why parents moved mountains for their children. Discreetly, he began acting like a father before even getting confirmation. He hired the country's best neurological specialists to evaluate. Rachel transferred her to a private room with better equipment and more comfortable seating, and ensured Sophie had proper meals and clean clothes. Money, for once, felt like it had real purpose. When Sophie asked why he was helping, James couldn't find words. Because every child deserves hope, was all he managed to say, though the truth was far more complex and terrifying. During their daily conversations, James learned about their life together. Sophie told him how Rachel worked 3 jobs when she was little, nursing during the day, cleaning offices at night, and weekends at a private clinic. But she always came home with energy to play with me. We'd have tea parties, and she'd let me paint her nails pink. She never spoke badly about you, Sophie continued, her blue eyes serious beyond her years. When I asked why you weren't with us, she said you were lost, but that good people always find their way home eventually. She made me promise never to be angry at you. James bought toys, books, and clothes for Sophie, but discovered she valued his presence more than any material gift. Can you read to me? Was her favorite request. Mommy always said you had the voice of someone who tells beautiful stories. She was right. Your voice makes me feel safe. During these intimate moments, James felt his hardened heart beginning to melt like ice in spring sunshine. For the first time in decades, he experienced unconditional love, both giving and receiving it. Sophie's trust was absolute and unquestioning, even though he'd been absent her entire life. Sophie shared memories that systematically destroyed every wall he built around his heart. Sometimes Mommy would cry at night when she thought I was sleeping. But when I asked her why, she'd say she wasn't sad, just missing someone very much. Then she'd hug me tight and say I had your exact eyes, so she never felt completely alone. The child's wisdom astounded him daily. Mommy says people aren't born mean, Sophie explained one afternoon while coloring. They just get hurt so much, they forget how to love. But love is like a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets. That's why she kept loving you, even when you were gone. James found himself looking forward to these hospital visits more than board meetings or billion-dollar deals. Sophie's laughter became his favorite sound, her innocent questions more important than any business decision he'd ever made. One afternoon, as he watched Sophie carefully arrange fresh flowers by Rachel's bedside, flowers he'd brought, but pretended, came from the hospital gift shop, James realized something that shook him to his core. He was already completely, irrevocably in love with this extraordinary little girl, who had burst into his life like a hurricane of pure hope and unconditional love. Whether the DNA test confirmed it or not, Sophie was already his daughter in every way that truly mattered. And for the first time since he could remember, James Mitchell felt like he was exactly where he belonged. The envelope with the DNA results arrived on a rainy Thursday morning. James opened it in his office alone, with hands trembling slightly, despite his attempts to maintain composure. 99.99% probability of paternity. Sophie was his daughter. James sat motionless for 2 hours, processing 8 years of lost life. 8 birthdays he hadn't celebrated, first steps he hadn't witnessed, nightmares he hadn't comforted. A daughter who had grown up without a father, yet somehow still loved him unconditionally, with a pure heart that humbled him completely. The weight of those lost years pressed down on him like a physical force. Every scraped knee he hadn't kissed, Every bedtime story he hadn't read, every school play he'd missed, all of it crashed over him in waves of regret, so intense he could barely breathe. When he finally arrived at the hospital, Sophie was drawing. At her mother's bedside, her small tongue poking out in concentration as she worked on what appeared to be another family portrait. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and her face immediately brightened with that radiant smile that had become his favorite sight in the world. "You found out, didn't you?" she asked with startling calmness, setting down her crayons and studying his face with those impossibly wise blue eyes. "How did you know?" James managed to ask, his voice rougher than usual. "Your eyes look different," Sophie observed, tilting her head thoughtfully. "Sadder, but also happier somehow. Like when you're crying, but also smiling at the same time." She jumped down from her chair and walked over to him slowly. "I always knew you were my daddy. You have the exact same eyes as me, and when you smile, which you should do more often, you look just like Mommy did in all those old pictures." James knelt down to her level, and for the first time since that chaotic day in the courtroom, Sophie threw her arms around his neck and hugged him fiercely. This was his daughter, his brave, incredible little warrior who had never stopped believing in him, even when he'd stopped believing in himself. "I'm so sorry," he whispered into her copper curls, breathing in her sweet scent of hospital soap and childhood innocence. "I'm so sorry it took me so long to find my way back to you." "It's okay, Daddy," Sophie replied, her voice muffled against his shoulder, but filled with absolute forgiveness. "You're here now. That's what matters. Mommy always said timing is everything, and maybe you needed to be ready to be the best daddy you could be." Her simple acceptance of his failures, her instant forgiveness of 8 years of absence, shattered something fundamental inside James's chest. This child possessed a capacity for love and grace that he'd never encountered in his cutthroat business world. That evening, James made a decision that would have been unthinkable just weeks before. He canceled every meeting scheduled for the following week, instructed his assistant to handle only absolute emergencies, and told his board of directors that family matters would take priority for the foreseeable future. For the first time in his adult life, James Mitchell chose love over profit, heart over ambition. And sitting in that hospital room with his newfound daughter reading him a story about brave princesses and happy endings, he realized he'd finally found something worth more than all his billions combined got. Sophie had given him the greatest gift imaginable, the chance to be the father she'd always believed he could be. Now he just had to prove worthy of her faith. Margaret Mitchell arrived at the hospital like a furious storm. At 68 years old, the Mitchell family matriarch still commanded respect and fear in equal measure. Her entrance into the IQ was marked by the sharp clicking of expensive heels on linoleum and the silent intimidation that radiated from her perfectly composed exterior. "James Edward Mitchell," she hissed, her voice carrying the authority of decades spent controlling every aspect of her son's life. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" Sophie, who had been peacefully coloring at Rachel's bedside, looked up with innocent curiosity. Her blue eyes sparkled with the natural friendliness of a child who hadn't yet learned to fear powerful people. "Are you my grandmother?" she asked sweetly, setting down her crayons and approaching Margaret with the same openness she showed everyone. Margaret examined the child with visible disdain, her aristocratic features twisted into an expression of disgust that would have intimidated grown men. "I am nobody's grandmother," she declared coldly, "especially not to some little bastard whose mother is clearly an opportunistic gold digger." The words hit the room like a physical slap. Sophie didn't understand all the big words, but she understood the tone perfectly. Her lower lip began to tremble as confusion and hurt clouded her innocent features. "Margaret," James stood up slowly, his voice carrying a warning edge she'd rarely heard before. "Watch your tongue. That's my daughter you're talking about." "You're Daughter? Margaret laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and cruel in the quiet hospital room. James, this is clearly an elaborate con job. Some scheming woman has coached this child to approach you in that courtroom for maximum dramatic effect. Can't you see how perfectly orchestrated this whole situation is? Sophie's eyes filled with tears as she backed toward her father's protective presence. Why is the mean lady being so awful? She whispered, her voice breaking with confusion. I just wanted my daddy to help save Mommy. Did I do something wrong? Because, Margaret stepped closer menacingly, her voice dripping with venom. You and your pathetic mother are nothing but parasites trying to suck the blood from the Mitchell family fortune. You're not wanted here, child. ENOUGH? James roared, moving swiftly to position himself between his mother and Sophie. His face was darker than anyone had ever seen it. Get out of here. Right now, before I have security escort you out in handcuffs. Margaret's eyes flashed with dangerous fury. If you continue with this ridiculous charade, she snarled, I will cut you off from the company completely and remove you from the family inheritance. You'll lose everything you've worked for, everything we've built together. James met her gaze steadily, surprising himself with the absolute certainty in his voice. Then so be it. I won't abandon my daughter for money or family approval. Margaret's face went white with shock. In 45 years, James had never defied her so completely, or chosen anyone over the family empire she'd helped him build. This isn't over, James, she warned as she turned to leave, her voice carrying decades of manipulation and control. That woman already destroyed your life once before. I won't stand by and watch her do it again through this child. As the hospital room door slammed behind her, Sophie pressed herself against James's side, her small body trembling with confusion and fear. Why does she hate me so much? Sophie asked in a tiny voice. What did I do wrong? I just want my mommy to get better. James knelt down and gathered his daughter into his arms, feeling her fragile trust and his mother's cruelty warring in his chest. You did nothing wrong, sweetheart, he said gently, stroking her copper curls. Some people have hearts so small and cold that they can't make room for love. But we're not like that, are we? Sophie shook her head against his shoulder. Mommy says hurt people, but love always wins in the end. Looking down at this wise, forgiving child, James realized that his daughter already possessed more grace and wisdom than his mother had learned in 68 years of living. James began establishing a completely new routine that transformed his entire existence. Every morning, he stopped at Sophie's favorite bakery to buy hot chocolate and blueberry muffins before they headed to the hospital together. Through these simple rituals, he learned that she loved adventure stories, despised broccoli with passionate intensity, and had a natural talent for mathematics that genuinely impressed him. Sophie showed him a secret diary she kept hidden in her backpack, pages and pages of drawings depicting the perfect family that always included James, even during all those years when he wasn't physically present in their lives. I draw you every single day, she confessed one afternoon, her small fingers tracing the crayon figures lovingly. Mommy said if I kept you alive in my heart, you would feel it somehow and find your way back to us. As stories Sophie shared about Rachel were absolutely devastating in their quiet heroism. Mommy worked 3 different jobs when I was really little, Sophie recounted matter-of-factly, as if such sacrifice was perfectly normal. She was a nurse during the day, cleaned office buildings at night, and worked weekends at a private clinic. But no matter how tired she was, she always came home with enough energy to play with me. She never once spoke badly about you, Sophie continued earnestly, her blue eyes serious beyond her 8 years. Whenever I asked why you weren't living with us like other daddies, she would get this sad but hopeful look and say that you were just lost right now, but that good people always eventually find their way home to the people who love them. James. bought expensive toys, educational books, and beautiful clothes for Sophie, but quickly discovered that she valued his presence far more than any material gifts money could buy. "Can you read to me?" became her favorite request, and she would curl up against his side with complete trust. "Mommy always said you probably had the kind of voice that could tell the most wonderful stories." She was absolutely right. Your voice makes everything feel safe and magical. During these precious intimate moments, James felt his chronically hardened heart beginning to thaw like ice melting in spring sunshine. For the first time in decades, he experienced the profound joy of unconditional love, both giving it freely and receiving it without reservation or conditions. Sophie shared memories that systematically demolished every emotional wall he'd spent years constructing around his heart. Sometimes at night, when she thought I was sleeping, I could hear Mommy crying quietly in her room, Sophie whispered one evening, her voice carrying wisdom far beyond her years. But when I would sneak in and ask her what was wrong, she'd dry her tears and hug me really tight. She'd say she wasn't actually sad, just missing someone very, very much. Then she'd tell me I had your exact same eyes, so she never felt completely alone because part of you was always with us. The child's natural wisdom and emotional intelligence astounded James daily. Mommy taught me that people aren't born mean or cruel, Sophie explained thoughtfully while arranging fresh flowers by Rachel's bedside. They just get hurt so deeply that they forget how to love properly. But love is exactly like a muscle. The more you use it and exercise it, the stronger and more powerful it becomes. James found himself eagerly anticipating these daily hospital visits, more than billion-dollar board meetings or corporate acquisitions that had once consumed his entire existence. Sophie's spontaneous laughter became his favorite sound in the world, and her innocent questions felt more important than any business decision he'd ever been forced to make. During these transformative weeks, James Mitchell discovered something that shook him to his very core. He was already completely, irrevocably, and desperately in love with this extraordinary little girl who had exploded into his carefully controlled life like a beautiful hurricane of pure hope, unconditional love, and infinite possibility. 3 weeks after the arrival of the country's most renowned neurological specialists, Rachel began showing genuinely encouraging signs of improvement. Her brain scans indicated significantly increased activity patterns, and occasionally her fingers would contract reflexively when Sophie spoke directly to her Dr. Peterson, the lead specialist whom James had flown in from Johns Hopkins, explained the situation with cautious optimism. "The progress is definitely promising, Mr. Mitchell, but we still don't fully understand the extent of the neurological damage. Whatever attacked her system did so in a very specific, almost surgical way that we've never encountered before." Sophie became absolutely ecstatic with any sign of progress, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant. "Look, Daddy," she shouted with pure joy when Rachel's eyes moved visibly beneath her closed eyelids during one of their daily reading sessions. "Mommy is trying so hard to wake up and come back to us." James began talking to Rachel every single day, sharing stories about Sophie's remarkable personality, asking for forgiveness for all the lost years, and making promises about their future together. "I don't know what really happened between us all those years ago," he would whisper during quiet moments, "but I swear on my life that I'm going to discover the complete truth. And this time, nothing and nobody will make me abandon you and Sophie ever again." One particularly emotional evening, while James was reading Charlotte's Web aloud to Sophie beside Rachel's bed, he noticed that the heart-monitoring machines showed distinctly different patterns whenever he spoke directly to Rachel. The changes were subtle, but unmistakable. It was as if Rachel was fighting with every ounce of strength to break through the barriers keeping her unconscious and reach back toward them. "She can definitely hear everything we're saying," Sophie declared with the absolute certainty that only children possess. Mommy always told me that love is infinitely more powerful than any sickness or medicine. She said love could move mountains, heal hearts, and even wake up sleeping princesses. James, who had once dismissed such sentiments as naive fairy tale thinking, now found himself believing completely in the power of love and hope. For Sophie's sake, for Rachel's recovery, and for this precious family he was learning to cherish. Above everything else, he was willing to believe in miracles and happy endings. The medical team remained cautiously optimistic, but realistic about Rachel's condition. The brain is remarkably resilient, Dr. Peterson explained during one of their weekly consultations. We're seeing neural pathways rebuilding themselves in ways that frankly surprise us. Her body is fighting back against whatever caused this condition. Sophie had developed her own theories about her mother's recovery. I think Mommy's brain was just waiting for the right time, she explained seriously while carefully braiding Rachel's hair. She needed to know that Daddy was here and that we were going to be a real family before she could wake up safely. During their daily vigil, James and Sophie established beautiful rituals together. They would bring fresh flowers every morning, read different stories each afternoon, and Sophie would sing the lullabies Rachel used to sing to her. James found these moments more meaningful than any achievement in his professional life. "Daddy," Sophie asked one evening as they prepared to leave the hospital, "do you think Mommy dreams about us when she's sleeping like this?" James considered the question seriously. "I think she dreams about all the wonderful things we're going to do together when she wakes up. Family picnics, birthday parties, bedtime stories, and all the hugs we've been saving up for her." Sophie smiled brightly. "Then we better keep talking to her so she knows we're here waiting. Love is the best medicine, right?" Looking at his daughter's unwavering faith and feeling Rachel's presence even in unconsciousness, James realized that this little family had already begun healing parts of his soul he hadn't even known were broken. And every day he grew more certain that together they could overcome anything. James's private investigator, a grizzled ex-detective named Mike Torres, arrived at the hospital with information that would fundamentally change everything. His weathered face was grim as he handed over a thick manila envelope that felt heavy with devastating secrets. "Mr. Mitchell, you need to sit down for this," Torres said solemnly. "What I'm about to show you will turn your entire understanding of the past decade upside down." The documents revealed an elaborate conspiracy that had been orchestrated with surgical precision over nearly 10 years. Margaret Mitchell had systematically destroyed James and Rachel's relationship with the calculated ruthlessness of a military campaign. "Your mother hired an entire network of people to intercept every single attempt Rachel made to contact you," Torres explained, spreading photographs and financial records across the small hospital table. Letters, emails, phone calls, even that personal visit to your office building. Everything was blocked, redirected, or simply destroyed before it ever reached you. The evidence was overwhelming and sickening. Bank records showed regular payments to postal workers, security guards, and administrative assistants. Phone logs revealed calls that were never forwarded. There were even signed affidavits from people Margaret had bribed to lie about delivering messages that James never received. But the revelations became exponentially more shocking. "Your mother has known about Sophie's existence for years, Mr. Mitchell. She hired surveillance teams to monitor Rachel and the child since Sophie was barely 2 years old. She knew exactly where they lived, where Rachel worked, what school Sophie attended. Everything." Torres showed him surveillance photographs that made James's blood run cold. Sophie walking to school alone, Rachel working late nursing shifts, both of them living their quiet, honest lives, while unknown watchers documented their every movement from the wall. Shadows. The most devastating revelation came with detailed toxicology reports that Torres had commissioned from an independent laboratory. Rachel was systematically poisoned, Mr. Mitchell. Small, carefully measured doses of thallium and mercury, administered over approximately 2 years. Someone wanted her illness to appear completely natural, a mysterious neurological condition that would baffle doctors. James felt physically nauseated as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. How was it administered? A woman calling. Herself, Helen Moss visited Rakeley for nearly 2 years, claiming to provide preventive health care, funded by an anonymous charitable organization. Torres continued grimly. This woman doesn't exist. Completely fabricated identity. But the payments for her services came directly from an account controlled by your mother. Torres produced surveillance photographs that shattered James's world. Margaret meeting secretly with the fake nurse, passing envelopes filled with cash, coordinating the systematic murder of the woman James loved. Your mother discovered that. Rachel was becoming increasingly suspicious about your supposed abandonment years ago. Rachel had started asking questions, hiring her own investigators, getting dangerously close to the truth. Margaret decided Rachel represented an unacceptable threat that needed to be permanently eliminated. The final piece of evidence was a recorded phone conversation between Margaret and her hired assassin. Make sure it looks natural. Margaret's voice was clear and unmistakable. A tragic illness that takes her slowly. The child will be orphaned, and James will never know what really happened. James stared at the surveillance photos of Sophie walking innocently to school, completely unaware that her mother was being slowly murdered by her own grandmother. The rage that consumed him was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. Pure, righteous fury at the woman who had stolen his family and nearly destroyed everything he could have loved. Looking at Sophie, who was peacefully reading to her poisoned mother, James felt a protective fury so intense it frightened him. His own mother had tried to commit murder and orphan his child, all to maintain control over his life and fortune. The war between love and evil had been raging for years, and James was only now discovering which side he was truly fighting for. After weeks of intensive treatment specifically designed to flush the toxic metals from her system, Rachel finally began the miraculous process of awakening from her medically induced coma. The recovery was gradual and beautiful. First a subtle movement of her fingers, then her eyelids fluttering like butterfly wings, and finally her green eyes slowly opening and struggling to focus on the world around her. Her first conscious gaze fell upon Sophie, who was sitting in her usual spot beside the bed, softly humming a lullaby that had become their daily ritual. My precious baby, Rachel whispered with a voice made rough by weeks of silence, but filled with infinite love and recognition. Sophie absolutely exploded with tears of pure, overwhelming joy. Mommy, Mommy, you came back to me, she cried, carefully climbing onto the bed to shower her mother's face with gentle kisses. I knew you would wake up. I never stopped believing. Then Rachel's slowly focusing eyes found James, who stood nervously at the foot of the bed, afraid to come closer, but unable to stay away. Her eyes immediately filled with tears, not of fear, anger, or resentment, but of profound relief and something that looked remarkably like gratitude. You actually came back, she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying the weight of 9 years of hope and heartbreak. James approached cautiously, his heart hammering against his ribs. Rachel, I am so incredibly sorry. I had no idea about Sophie, about what my mother did to us, about any of the evil that was happening. I thought you had chosen to disappear from my life. Rachel reached out with trembling fingers and squeezed his hand with surprising strength. I always knew, deep in my heart, that you would come back. When we needed you most, she said, each word requiring tremendous effort, but delivered with absolute conviction. Mommy always told me you would return, Sophie announced excitedly, bouncing slightly on the bed. Even when people said she was crazy for waiting, she never gave up hope, not even for one single day. As Rachel gradually regained her ability to speak in longer sentences, she began sharing her version of the events that had torn them apart. "Your mother came to see me when Sophie was just 6 months old," she revealed, her voice growing stronger with each word. "She brought what looked like proof that you had married someone else. Photos, legal documents, everything looked so official and real. But I never married anyone," James said, devastated by the scope of his mother's deception. "I eventually figured that out years later," Rachel continued. "But by then, every time I tried to reach you, your people would say that you had made it crystal clear you wanted no contact with me whatsoever." Rachel's most heartbreaking revelation came next. "In the past few years, I started becoming really suspicious that something wasn't right about the whole situation. I began investigating, asking questions, trying to piece together what had really happened between us. That's when I started getting sick. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Margaret had begun poisoning Rachel precisely when she started getting close to uncovering the truth about their forced separation. I'm so sorry I wasn't here to protect you," James whispered, bringing Rachel's hand to his lips. "I should have fought harder to find the truth. I should have trusted my heart instead of believing lies." "You're here now," Rachel said simply, her green eyes shining with forgiveness and something that looked like renewed love. "That's what matters. We have the rest of our lives to make up for lost time." Sophie wiggled between her parents, creating a spontaneous family sandwich that filled the hospital room with laughter for the first time in weeks. "Now we can finally be the family I've been drawing in all my pictures," she declared triumphantly. As James looked at his recovering love and his radiant daughter, he realized that this reunion wasn't just about healing Rachel's body. It was about healing their family's soul and reclaiming the happiness that had been stolen from them by someone who was supposed to love them unconditionally. The real battle was just beginning, but for the first time in 9 years, they would face it together. As Rachel continued her remarkable recovery, she and James began the delicate, emotionally complex process of rebuilding a connection that had been violently severed 9 years earlier. It wasn't simple or straightforward. There was so much accumulated pain, countless unanswered questions, and nearly a decade of lost memories that needed to be carefully examined and healed. Rachel shared the devastating details of how Margaret had orchestrated their separation with ruthless precision. "She came to see me when Sophie was barely 6 months old," Rachel recalled, her voice steady but filled with old pain. "She brought what appeared to be ironclad proof that you had married a wealthy socialite from your social circle. Professional. Photographs of you with another woman, seemingly official marriage documents, even fake newspaper announcements. She told me you were deliriously happy and that I was selfishly interfering with your new life." The cruelty of Margaret's deception took James's breath away. "Even when I was pregnant and completely alone, I tried reaching out to you multiple times," Rachel continued. "But I always received the exact same cold response. Mr. Mitchell has made it abundantly clear that he wants absolutely no contact with you under any circumstances." James felt physically sick, discovering the web of lies his mother had constructed around their love. "She told me you had betrayed me with my best friend from college," he revealed, his voice cracking with emotion. "She provided what looked like photographic evidence, convinced me to take heavy medication for anxiety that left my memories confused and fragmented for months." "There was never any betrayal," Rachel said with absolute firmness, reaching for his hand. "I loved you completely then, and honestly, I never stopped loving you through all these years of separation." Sophie, who had been quietly listening to this painful conversation while coloring at the foot of the bed, suddenly looked up with hopeful excitement. "Does this mean you're going to get married now, and we can be a real family?" she asked with the innocent directness that children possess. Both James and Rachel laughed spontaneously. The first genuine, shared laughter they'd experienced together in nearly a decade. The sound was like music filling the sterile hospital room. "Let's take things slowly, sweetheart," Rachel said gently, though her eyes met James's with a warmth that promised incredible possibilities. "First, Mommy needs to get completely healthy and strong again, and Daddy and I need to spend time learning how to be friends again after so many years apart." But even as she spoke those cautious words, the way her fingers intertwined naturally with James's suggested that perhaps some connections are too powerful to ever be truly broken. James had already begun making practical preparations for their future together. He purchased a spacious, beautiful house in a quiet neighborhood near the hospital, complete with a large garden where Sophie could play safely and bright. Airy rooms designed specifically for Rachel's continued recovery and rehabilitation. During Rachel's physical therapy sessions, James and Sophie would sit together working on homework or reading stories. James discovered that his daughter had inherited his analytical mind and Rachel's compassionate heart, a combination that made her absolutely extraordinary. "Daddy," Sophie asked one afternoon while they watched Rachel work with her physical therapist, "are you happy that we found you?" James considered the question seriously, watching the woman he'd never stopped loving regain her strength and the daughter who had transformed his entire existence. "Sophie, finding you and your mother didn't just make me happy. It made me feel like I finally came alive after years of just existing. The healing process wasn't just medical. It was emotional and spiritual. Each day brought new conversations, rediscovered connections, and the gradual rebuilding of trust that had been shattered by years of lies and manipulation." For the first time since that terrible separation, James Mitchell felt like he was exactly where he belonged, with his family, building the future that should have been theirs all along. Margaret Mitchell arrived at the hospital one final time, accompanied by intimidating private security guards and clutching what appeared to be an official court order designed to look authentically legal and threatening. She marched through the ICU corridors as if she owned the entire building, radiating the kind of cold authority that had controlled James's life for decades. "James, this charade ends today," she announced with imperial finality, waving the document dramatically. "I have a legal order to remove this child from your temporary custody immediately. You've been declared an unfit father due to your well-documented history of mental instability and questionable judgment." Sophie instinctively moved behind James's protective presence, her small body trembling with fear as she sensed the danger emanating from this cold woman. Rachel, though still recovering her strength, struggled to sit up straighter in her hospital bed, maternal instincts flaring despite her physical weakness. "You cannot and will not do this," James said with deadly calm, his voice carrying a steel edge that Margaret had never heard before. "I absolutely can and will," Margaret replied with venomous satisfaction. "This illegitimate child will be placed in a proper adoptive family, far away from you, and this manipulative opportunist who's clearly poisoned your mind against your own family." At that precise moment, Mike Torres entered the room flanked by two genuine police officers and a federal prosecutor, whose presence immediately shifted the entire atmosphere. "Margaret Mitchell," the prosecutor announced formally, his voice carrying the full weight of federal authority, "you are under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, falsification of legal documents, identity theft, and obstruction of justice." Margaret's aristocratic face drained of all color as the reality of her situation crashed down upon her. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she sputtered, but her voice lacked its usual commanding confidence. "We have overwhelming evidence of deliberate poisoning administered over a 2-year period, forged documents spanning nearly a decade, falsified identities, and a complete financial trail leading directly back to accounts you control," the prosecutor continued methodically. "The court order you're holding is also completely falsified, adding another felony to your growing list of charges. As the handcuffs clicked around Margaret's wrists, she turned toward James with eyes blazing with fury and desperation. "You're making the biggest mistake of your life," she screamed as officers began leading her away. "That woman will destroy you just like she did before. You'll lose everything: your company, your reputation, your entire future." Sophie, demonstrating courage and wisdom that astounded every adult in the room, walked directly up to Margaret despite her obvious fear. "I'm really sorry that you're so hurt and angry inside that you felt like you had to hurt other people," she said with remarkable composure for an 8-year-old. "I hope that maybe while you're in prison, you can find a way to heal your heart and learn how to love people instead of hurting them." James knelt down beside his daughter, overwhelmed by her capacity for forgiveness. "How can you possibly say something so kind after everything she's done to us?" "Because Mommy always taught me that people who hurt others are usually just people who are hurting really badly inside themselves," Sophie explained with simple wisdom. Maybe now she have time to figure out how to fix what's broken in her heart. As Margaret was escorted away in handcuffs, still screaming threats and protests, James realized that his 8-year-old daughter possessed more genuine wisdom, compassion, and emotional intelligence than his mother had demonstrated in 68 years of living. The evil that had torn their family apart was finally being held accountable, and the three of them could begin building their future without fear, manipulation, or lies. "Is it really over, Daddy?" Sophie asked quietly, slipping her small hand into his. "Yes, sweetheart," James replied, pulling both his daughter and Rachel into a protective embrace. "The scary part is finally over. Now we get to focus on all the beautiful, happy parts of being a family together." For the first time in nearly a decade, their future was truly their own to create. 6 months later, their new life together was flourishing beyond anything James had ever imagined possible. Rachel had made a complete recovery from the poisoning and returned to work as head nurse at a new pediatric clinic that James had funded, combining her passion for helping children with his resources to create something meaningful. Sophie was thriving in an excellent private school, surrounded by stability and unconditional love for the first time in her young life. She was finally free to simply be a normal 8-year-old child, playing with friends, participating in school activities, and coming home every day to parents who were completely devoted to her happiness. James had undergone his own remarkable transformation. While he still managed Mitchell Tech Corporation successfully, he now delegated responsibilities, worked reasonable hours, and used his enormous wealth for genuinely significant causes. Under his new compassionate leadership style, the company actually prospered more than ever before. The house they shared had become a warm sanctuary filled with Sophie's artwork covering the refrigerator, the constant sound of laughter echoing through every room, and the comfortable noise of a family truly discovering each other. James learned to make weekend pancakes, help with homework every evening, and read bedtime stories with voices for all the different characters. "Daddy," Sophie asked one night as he tucked her into her new bedroom, "do you ever feel sad about all the time we lost before we found each other?" James considered her question thoughtfully. "I miss every moment I wasn't here with you and your mother. But if I hadn't lost you both, maybe I never would have learned how precious and important you are to me. And now I know that I'm the luckiest man in the entire world." Rachel, who had been listening from the doorway with a gentle smile, joined them for their nightly family hug. Later, after Sophie was peacefully asleep, she and James sat together on the porch swing he had installed, watching stars appear in the clear evening sky. "Do you think we can really make this work?" Rachel asked softly, her hand naturally finding his. "After everything that happened, can we build something lasting?" "I'd like to try," James replied honestly, "if you'll let me prove that I can be the man you and Sophie deserve." It wasn't a dramatic declaration or a cinematic moment. It was something far better. It was real, honest, and built on a foundation of love that had been tested by the worst possible circumstances and proven unbreakable. Their second chance at happiness was just beginning. 1 year later, on a perfect spring morning filled with sunshine and possibility, James awakened to the sound of laughter drifting from their backyard garden. From his bedroom window, he watched Sophie teaching Rachel how to play baseball, apparently a skill she had learned at school and was eager to share. "You have to keep your eye on the ball, Mommy," Sophie called out, giggling when Rachel swung and missed completely, nearly losing her balance in the process. James hurried downstairs and joined them on the grass, and within minutes, all three were tumbling together in a laughing heap, rolling around like puppies in the warm sunshine. It was such a simple, ordinary moment, but for James, it represented everything he had never known he wanted from life. That afternoon, while Sophie napped peacefully on the living room sofa after their active morning, James and Rachel settled together on the porch swing he had built with his own hands. "Rachel," he said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket with slightly trembling fingers, "I lost 9 precious years of your life and Sophie's childhood. I can't recover that lost time, but I can promise that I will never waste another day of the life we have ahead of us." Rachel gasped softly when he opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring that caught the afternoon sunlight beautifully. "This isn't about money or social status," James continued earnestly. "This is about making a sacred promise. I promise to be here every single day, through joys and sorrows, through pancake mornings and nightmare evenings. I promise to be the father Sophie deserves and the man you always believed I could become." "James," Rachel whispered, tears of happiness streaming down her face. "Rachel Carter, will you marry me? For real this time? Forever and always?" "Yes," she laughed through her tears of pure joy. "1,000 times yes." Sophie, who had awakened and quietly listened from the doorway, suddenly came running toward them shouting, "Finally! I was wondering when you were going to ask her." 3 months later, they were married in a simple but beautiful ceremony in their own backyard garden, with Sophie serving as the world's proudest and most radiant maid of honor. Margaret remained in prison, but James discovered he felt no anger toward her, only pity for a woman who had never learned that love multiplies when shared, rather than diminishes. As James danced with Rachel at their wedding reception, with Sophie spinning between them, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun when a brave little girl burst into that courtroom and changed his life forever. Sophie hadn't just found her father, she had saved his soul, proving that true love possesses the power to redeem even the most hardened hearts. She had shown him that it's never too late to choose to become the person that those who love us always knew we could be. Their family was finally complete and whole.